over to Shan's house, and she had a young man, her son, Loma, who listened so intently. It was like he was completely focused on every word I had to say on taking care of these babies. He was very serious and took it with great weight, how to raise and release these kids, the little doves. And he and I colluded a little bit together as to how to draw Shan further in so that perhaps she would be rehabilitating birds with her love of birds, becoming a wildlife rehabber, getting state and federal licenses, building an aviary, and through all of this, working with me to start Wing It. Shan Goshorn started Wing It with me. And Loma went on that year to write a paper for his English class, which I still have a copy of because he had great reviews from his teacher with a gigantic A+ on it. And he and Shan and I all enjoyed one particular group of birds, and that was the blue jays. Baby blue jays were our very favorites. I'm kind of a snob. My bias is I like smart animals. So I was getting to work with a smart woman, her smart son, and smart baby birds, the jays. Time went on, and Loma continued with his interest in birds, going through getting a degree in wildlife ecology and working as a teacher, becoming accepted into grad school, and now can boast a PhD studying what's really my very favorite of all the birds, and that's crows. I'd like to introduce you all to the Loma Pendergraft tonight, and we've got lots of fun stuff we're going to get to hear from. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, so my name is Loma Pendergraft. I'm a recently minted PhD from the University of Washington. And for my research, I studied crows and crow intelligence. And so I gave a talk here at the Audubon Society about 5 years ago or so. It's been a while. I don't know if any of you were present for that talk, but I've had some practice. And so, as part of this talk, I really want to emphasize that it's a talk. Talk involves more than one person. So, if you have questions for me over the course of this presentation, please feel free, raise your hand. Feel free to chime in and ask, and I will talk to you, and we can start talking about these wonderful birds. So, let's talk about crows. Crows are the topic of tonight. And I've titled my presentation, Crows, Clever, Curious, and Charismatic, because generally speaking, if you are interested in crows, it's because they are one of those three things. However,
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
thanks, sir. However, not all of you here are avid bird nerds. So I feel like it's important to establish a couple of things first. Because one of the biggest things that people ask me when they find out, hey, you studied crows, right, is what is the difference between a crow and a raven? There we go. And it's a pretty common question because, you have other animals like pumas, cougars, and mountain lions. Those are just different names for the same animal. So that becomes a question, can I just use crow and raven interchangeably? Turns out you can't. These are different species. Can anyone here tell me, what is the difference between a crow and a raven? An American crow and a common raven, specifically.
A crow has 9 pinions, a raven has 11 pinions. So the difference is in a matter of opinion.
Ah, there you go. That's a good one, I like that one. I've heard a lot of crow puns over the last couple of days. So for example, I believe this is the very end of Hanukkah. Thank you very much. Hope you have a Merry Crowsmas. Sorry about that. I have to inflict that on you at least once. So, who can tell me the biggest difference between a crow and a raven? Yeah.
Size.
Size. Yeah, it's a big difference. Ravens are a lot bigger than crows. So here we have 2 photos of myself I've caught On the left, an American crow, and on the right, a common raven. The crow is about the same size as a pigeon, maybe slightly bigger. But the raven, though, that bird is huge. It's about the same size as a red-tailed hawk. In fact, if you look at it, its shoulders come up to my nose and its feet go down to my belly button. These are big birds. There are other differences too, besides the matter of how many opinions they have. And that would be things like their tail feather shape. So the crow feathers, or crow tail, is rounded like a fan, a handheld fan. Whereas the common raven, their tail feathers are more diamond shaped. It's hard to see in these photos, might have to go back over here, but look at the beak. Crow beaks, I mean, they're big, and they're also big birds, but raven beaks, ravens have huge beaks. In fact, if you were somehow to take a raven and shrink it down to the size of a crow, its beak would still be considerably bigger. They also sound different. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the crow's caw. Ravens, though, they sound a little bit different. I would best describe their vocalizations as more of a cronk. I'm not as familiar with where ravens are here in Oklahoma, but in Washington, ravens are more rural, whereas crows are more urban. But I don't actually know all that much about the local birds here in Oklahoma. It's not with these birds. But a key thing that draws people's attention to crows, ravens, and other members of their family, a taxonomic group called Corvidae, is the fact they do things that we might find really entertaining. So here's a video taken from someplace in Eastern Europe, possibly Russia. And I say that because the bird involved here is a hooded crow, and that's where they live. And we'll just see what this bird is doing. And the striking thing is, it takes its toy and flies back up to the top with it. It tries over there, but it doesn't work very well. It needs snow. After a while, it changes tactics. A few taps. So they do odd behaviors that we find very funny. Here's another example. So I don't know about you, but I would classify this as play behavior. Now that does bring up a very good question though. Why is this happening? This is an adult bird. And whenever we think about play behavior, we tend to think about young animals. Think like wolf pups or lion cubs. They play. But oftentimes their play is an imitation of the types of behaviors that they would do as an adult. It's almost as though they're practicing. Kittens or cubs like to pounce things. That's good practice for when they're adults and they have to hunt. Wolf cubs and puppies, dog puppies, like to wrestle. Again, that's practice for when they grow up and have to do that for real. But these are adult birds. They don't have to practice because they're already adults. So why do they do this play behavior? And here's a photo of two crows that are doing barrel rolls. We have so many examples of crows doing different play behaviors. Well, scientists have come up with a number of different hypotheses for why these animals are doing play behavior, and two of the more popular ones are play helps them learn important skills. Again, just like I described earlier with the young animals, practice for adulthood. We also think maybe play is a way to boost creativity or develop your intelligence. Well, scientists have actually taken multiple animals of different species and they've looked at how often each individual plays. They encourage play in some and they discourage play in others. Try to get two groups. And then they test those groups. See how well does each group handle novel tasks? How well do they handle problems that require creativity? And in those cases, there was no difference between the groups that were allowed and encouraged to play and those that weren't. So in the case of adult animals that regularly play, these don't seem to be supported by the evidence. So we've come up with more hypotheses. We think that maybe play behavior might be a way to explore boundaries. You'll oftentimes see this with crows and other corvids. How many of you have seen these birds harassing another animal by sneaking behind them and yanking on their tail? It's just a thing that crows and ravens do. And we think that that is partly them exploring boundaries. They're trying to figure out, okay, what am I allowed to get away with this animal? And how fast are its reflexes? They're learning, okay, if I'm gonna steal food from this animal, I can take my time or I have to be on my toes. They're learning, they're exploring and testing boundaries. And if anything, play behavior seems to be a byproduct of intelligence. So these animals play because they are smart. They're not smart because they play. Think about the other animals that play as adults. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, those are primates. Dolphins, whales, cetaceans. We also have elephants. These are all examples of groups of animals that are very smart. And they all have documented cases where we observe the adults doing play behavior. Crows and ravens included. They're very smart, but also very mysterious. So this is a video, I didn't take it, but it was taken at a small town in Washington, just northeast of Seattle, called Bothell. And, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and play it, let you see what it is. Bothell is about 20 minutes away from Seattle, where I live. I did a study and figured there are about 15,000 crows that came here every night to sleep. We call this a communal roost. And we think that these birds, some of whom are traveling 10, 20 miles to get there every night, and then traveling 10, 20 miles again in the morning to go back to their territories, we think they do this for a number of reasons. They gather in these huge numbers because there's safety in numbers. And there's safety in numbers for more than one reason. If you are one bird amidst, say, a group of 5 birds, and an owl comes out of nowhere and takes one of you, your odds of being taken by that owl are 1 in 5, 20%. Not great. But if you're a one individual amidst 15, 16,000, well, suddenly your odds got a lot better. You're diluting your risk of being taken by a predator. And furthermore, with this many individuals, with this many birds, that's a lot of eyes. It's a lot of eyes looking around for danger. There's very little chance that a raccoon or an owl would be able to take any of these birds by surprise with that many sentinels present. It also happens to be a good location. So that particular area in Bothell is a small wetlands. On one side, you have a highway. We have those big lights to make sure that you can see where you're going when you're driving on the highway. On the other side is the University of Washington's Bothell campus, where they have athletic fields. You have those big stadium lights. And all this light is important because crows can't actually see very well in the dark. So you might imagine if you're a crow and you're bedded down, you're trying to sleep, and something scares you, and you take off, and you're flying, but you can't see. That's dangerous. If you crash into a branch because you couldn't see it, you're going to break your wing. That's a death sentence to a wild crow. With this many light sources available, they feel much safer. If they have to take off, they'll be able to find a new place to land. We also think there are social benefits of gathering these huge numbers. We know that ravens will exchange information on where you could find food. Like a juvenile raven going out in the winter in Maine might find a dead elk carcass, but it's being guarded by 2 adults. They can't get close. So what it'll do is it'll go to one of these roosts and it'll recruit a whole band of vagrant ravens. And that group will go, overwhelm the adults, they can't defend it anymore, and suddenly everyone has access to this meal. We don't know if crows do that, but these roosts are noisy. So they're clearly talking and exchanging information. They wouldn't do that if they weren't getting some sort of benefit from it. Oh yeah, information exchange, social benefits. They also might have chances to encounter potential mates, to learn about their neighbors. So they do this even though there are costs associated with living in a roost. You have to travel 10, 20 miles every day, there and back. That's a lot of energy expenditure. You also have a huge number of birds all in one location, so it's a vector for diseases. And because crows have a dominance hierarchy, and there's only so many trees they can roost in, well, the higher ranked individuals get the spots at the top, nice and sheltered. The lower ranked individuals have to settle for the bottom, and they get pretty whitewashed by the morning. Despite that, they still continue to do this because the benefits clearly outweigh the costs. Now, I mentioned earlier that roosts are very noisy. And that's because crows can give a lot of different vocalizations. For my master's, I actually studied some of these vocalizations. And very briefly, I can say that scientists have no idea what most of these things are. We can broadly categorize the different sounds they make into caws and not a caw. I know, scientists are great at classifying things. But to provide you with an example, a caw, a structured caw, would sound something like this. So it gives some calls, but then it pauses and listens. Calls some more, listens some more. That would be an example of structured caws. But that's not the only type of caw they can give. They also give unstructured caws. In this case, the bird is just yelling. There's no structure to it. It's not pausing to listen. It's freaked out, and it's just vocalizing. That is a call they give in response to predators. But caws are, we think their purpose is to spread information across a great distance. They're loud. You can hear it from quite a ways away. These other examples that I'm going to play are much quieter. So for example, we have a rattle call. It's not a caw, it's just a call. It sounds like this. How many of you have heard that from a crow? Not many. I think 2, maybe 3. It's a very quiet sound. And because it's so quiet, we think its purpose is to explain information to another bird that's close by, like a mate or a family member. Here's another example. This is similar to the rattle. It has the same acoustic characteristics, but it's shorter. It's called a growl. A bit quiet. I've heard them give that call as they're dive bombing a predator. And finally, this last example I'm going to play, it's very quiet, so you're going to have to listen. But it's going to sound like the crow is very faintly saying, hello, hello. Take a listen. That's a crow. I'm going to tell you right now, we have no idea what that means. In fact, most research that has looked at crow vocalizations, you'll notice, were by graduate students who never revisit the subject again after they graduate. I'm in good company. Now, as a graduate student at the University of Washington, I used to feed the crows. And I noticed that whenever you toss food out to them, they start calling as they flew in to eat. Here's an example. Now this is curious to me, because if they're calling to attract other crows, wouldn't that mean that they get less food for themselves? So I set up an experiment to try to figure out why are they calling whenever there's food present. So basically what I do is I record different sounds they give for 3 minutes before I did anything to them. Then I'd throw a big pile of peanuts out, and they'd get very excited, and they'd start calling and gathering around to eat it, and I'd record the calls they gave during that period of time. And finally, once all the food was gone, I continued to record the sounds they made for 5 minutes as they calmed down and returned to the baseline. And I identified 2 distinct calls of interest. Now, before I go any further, I should probably explain. These graphs on the right, they're called spectrograms. They are a way to sort of visualize sound energy. So, this top one, for example, we're going to hear 4 sounds. The vast majority of that energy is going to be concentrated in the 1 to 2 kilohertz range. And then there's going to be about 5 seconds of silence and then 4 more sounds. And each sound is going to be about half a second to a second long. So here's an example of that. So those calls are displayed, medium structured caws. They would give those calls whenever there was no food around. Okay, great. Whenever I toss food out, they tend to shift their calls into shorter caws, which I called short structured caws. And you can tell from the spectrogram, they're a lot smaller or shorter in duration than the medium structured caws. They're about 0.2 seconds long. Here's an example. Okay, great. So these calls are associated with food. They're probably going to bring other birds in. So what I did was I set up what we call a playback study, where I would play this call to them or this call to them through a loudspeaker, which I have hidden in a bush or a tree, and trick the listening crows into thinking, there's another crow in there and it's calling. And I basically just see how upset that made them. I looked at a number of different behaviors to try to figure out what each call type meant. So for example, I would measure how many crows were there in the area after I started playing. That's a good indication about whether or not the sound I'm playing is attracting crows or repelling crows. I looked at what sorts of calls are the crows giving in response. I looked at how close to the speaker does the listening crow get. That would tell me that it's trying to find and probably evict the intruder as it perceives it on its territory. I looked at feather posturing. That's where the bird fluffs its feathers up and sort of walks around with a very exaggerated strut. That's a dominance display. The focal crow is trying to intimidate the other crows. And finally, I looked at wing and tail flicking. That's where the bird sort of flips its wings and its tail open, but doesn't take off. It just sits there and does that. Crows will do that whenever they are agitated or upset about something. And come to find out, I still have no idea what these short structured calls mean. They're given around food, but whenever you hide food near the speaker, the crow is not more likely to find it. But I was able to figure out that these medium structured calls, the ones they do not give around food, those are territorial calls. If you play that, if you play those long calls, that ha, 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 listening crows, if they're on the territory, will get very upset. They'll get puffed up. They'll start trying to find the speaker to evict the intruder. And if you've hidden food anywhere nearby, they're more likely to find it. So I don't know why crows are giving these short structured calls around food, but I know why they are avoiding giving these medium structured calls, because they would bring in rivals who are showing up to try to defend their territory. They turn up going, okay, you want to fight? Oh, hey, peanuts. And so that means they get less for themselves. So my guess is that these are identification calls. They're trying to let their mate or their family know, it is me, I am here. And that might be a good idea for the other birds to show up as well. But without further information, without being able to band the birds or identify them, I won't be able to tell that for certain. So again, there's a reason why so many people have looked at crow vocalizations and then abandoned ship. They're very tricky animals to study. They also do strange behaviors, things that we might even consider sinister. So in this photo, we have an adult crow that is doing an odd protective display over a taxidermy crow that has been mounted to look as though it's just been hit by a car and is dead on the road. And whenever this happens, the crow that finds the dead bird will start calling, and other crows will show up, and they will become very upset. They'll start flying over the corpse, and they'll start calling themselves. It's a very strange behavior. And in order to delve into what's going on here, first I have to take a step back and talk about what is that behavior in general. So I'm going to play a video, and well, I'm just going to play the video and let you think of what you think. So what's going on? We had a bald eagle minding its own business, preening itself, when suddenly the crows found it. And then the crows started mobbing. So this is a behavior that crows love to do. It's also common in other bird species like blue jays and chickadees. And that's where whenever one of them finds a crow or finds a predator, it'll give a scold. It's a type of alarm call. Other birds who can hear it will drop what they're doing, fly to the area, and if they agree, yeah, that is in fact a dangerous predator, they'll join in. And together, they'll collectively start harassing the target. They'll start dive bombing it, they'll start scolding it, they'll start pulling tail feathers, and basically their goal is to just annoy the predator until it leaves the area. Of course, this strategy can be very dangerous. I have observed on more than one occasion crows mobbing a red-tailed hawk and a bald eagle on separate occasions. And in both cases, one of the mobbing crows got too close and the bird of prey was able to flip around and grab it out of the air and kill it. But they still do it despite the danger. And we think that that's because they get a huge benefit from doing this. Not only are they driving the animal away, they're trying to spread awareness of this animal. So you might have noticed in the video, the crows were being very aggressive toward that eagle. The eagle, beyond just sort of, okay, go away, wasn't all that bothered by it. To the crows, the eagle represents a clear and present danger, but to the eagle, this is Tuesday. So the noise of all that calling and scolding and vocalizing, it serves to ruin the predator's ability to hunt. All those animals I just mentioned, hawks, eagles, they hunt birds like crows by taking them by surprise. The crow is there on the ground foraging when suddenly out of nowhere a hawk flies in and grabs them. The element of surprise has to be there. But if there's a mob, then the element of surprise is gone. A crow can decide, okay, I'm done mobbing, I'm hungry, I'm gonna go forage again. It flies back to its territory. As long as there's some bird mobbing, it can listen. And it can realize, okay, yeah, the predator's over there. Oh, it's moving. Okay, now it's over there now. There's no risk that it will be snuck up on by that predator. But let's go back to the funeral behavior. Why do this? Where they mob, but the subject of their mobbing attempt is not a predator, the subject is a dead crow. Specifically a dead adult crow. They don't seem to care all that much about baby crows. We think because it's to learn about new sources of danger. So the person who took this photograph, Kaylee Swift, was a colleague of mine, and she studied crow funerals for her PhD. And what she was able to determine was that if a dead crow shows up and the crows mob it and have their little funeral, they become very on edge for the next couple of days at that location. They're very aware, they're very cognizant of anything out of the ordinary, and it'll take them longer to approach food. If there's a dog or another potential predator that was near the stuffed crow, they would suddenly start treating that dog or whatever as a dangerous threat. This means that if you have a dead crow on your property, wait until nighttime before you get rid of it. Because if a living crow sees you holding the dead crow, they're going to associate you as the cause of death. They're very intelligent. they're able to learn about new sources of danger through these crow funerals. That's not all they can learn. So part of my research is into their intelligence, into their ability to learn and solve novel tasks. So in this example, we have what we call a string pull task. Let me show you how it works. You have the perch, you have a piece of string tied to the perch, and at the very end of the string, hanging from the perch, is a piece of food that they really like. In this case, a chicken nugget. They love chicken nuggets. And so, of course, the goal is, I put this in their cage and they have to figure out how to get it. By and large, they don't tend to have much trouble doing this. So, believe this is Sky Blue here. Yeah, Sky Blue will demonstrate one of the methods. So just to kind of explain really quick, this is a camera that's on the floor of the aviary looking upwards. So you have this red water bowl here, we have Sky Blue here, and then we have the food hanging up. And let's see what Sky Blue does. Oh, well, that's easy. But you'll notice Sky Blue only got a small piece of the chicken nugget. The rest of it's still up there, and it's swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Sky Blue's gonna have to wait for it to stop swinging before she can fly up and try again. And that method requires the bird to actually fly up and hover for a split second, so it's gonna be difficult for the larger individuals to do that method. So I call this the fly up and grab method, or fly up and intercept method. Another method they did when I first introduced this to their cage was what I call the attacking string method. That's where they don't fly up to the food at all. They fly to where the string is knotted to the perch and they start banging on it and pulling it and tearing at it. And eventually the string breaks, falls to the ground, they fly down and they eat it. Again, pretty straightforward, but also it requires some effort. They have to physically destroy the string, which means it's harder for smaller individuals to do this. So we have two separate strategies that these birds will do about 50-50, depending on how big they are, when they're first introduced to this task. But give them a couple of weeks, and they learn a new method. Dark Blue is going to demonstrate this method. So Dark Blue has reached down, pulled up the string, and stepped on it to prevent it from falling back down. And does it again, and again. And through this is able to ratchet the food up to where he can get it. It's quick, it's easy, and you don't have to deal with either breaking the string or flying up and leaving parts of it behind. You get the entire thing. And you'll notice Dark Blue's neighbors were watching him. And that was actually the topic of this experiment. One of the things I was interested in was, can these crows learn to solve a novel task by watching their peers? So I actually introduced this task to the even-numbered cages. The odd-numbered cages had to watch. The idea being that after 2 weeks of watching, they'd be able to pick this up much more rapidly than their neighbors were. And it turns out they can't, or don't. But here's the thing, they were slower to learn than the birds that modeled this behavior for them. But they almost always, with only a single exception, copied the method shown by their neighbors. So in a weird way, they both do and don't learn. What I think was happening is that these birds were learning, but they weren't just learning the task, they were learning captivity. They knew, okay, yeah, there's chicken nugget there, that's great and all, but if I just wait 2 hours, I'll get some dog food and some hard-boiled eggs. So they no longer had the same driving motivation that the first birds had when they were first brought into captivity. Now, this is an example of learning. These birds, with only 2 exceptions, were not able to do the string pull method, at least not at first. They had to learn how to do that. But crows are also capable of something called insight. Insight is a little bit different than learning. Insight is where you consider the problem, and then with very little trial and error, you just get it. In this example, I love showing this video because there's a moment where you suddenly understand exactly what happened. This is a New Caledonian crow, so not our local American crows. These birds came from the island of New Caledonia, which is close to Australia, I believe. And New Caledonia is unique because there are no woodpeckers on New Caledonia. So you have this entire unexploited niche of food in the form of grubs and insect larvae that are just hiding just out of reach in little tree crevices. Well, these birds, New Caledonian crows, figured out that they can use tools to extract these insects so they can get them. They will use things like spines from spine plants, but one thing that they're known for is using what's called the leaf of a pandanus plant. And this plant, the leaves, the edges are serrated like a saw blade. So what they'll do is they'll actually make a little cut on the outside of the leaf. They'll kind of peel the edge off, they'll make another little cut. They've got a long, thin strip of leaf material that is serrated. And all they have to do is just stick that in there. The little serrated edges will grip the grub and they can just pull it out. Pretty easy. And this experiment, this bird, Betty, and her mate, Abel, were given a tube, a hollow tube, and inside that tube is a basket with a piece of food inside. I forget whether it's a mealworm or a piece of ham, but it doesn't matter. These birds were given 2 wires, a straight piece of wire and a hooked piece of wire. The goal of the experiment was, okay, they need to select the correct tool that is appropriate for the task and use it. Well, unfortunately for Betty, her mate, Abel, stole the hooked piece of wire, grabbed it and flew off with it. All she had left to work with was a straight piece of wire. So let's see what she does. So she starts by trying to scrape it along the side. That doesn't work. Tries stabbing it a couple of times. That doesn't work either. So she changes tactics. She jams the piece of wire into the outside of the container where the tape is, pulls it around, and pops it out. And using her new hooked tool, she's able to pull the basket out of the tube and collect her food reward. Yeah, the local American crows can't do this, at least not without some training. New Caledonian crows are absolutely amazing when it comes to crafting and using tools. Now, the lab that I worked with at the University of Washington, I worked with John Marsloff. And in fact, I think it might have been a coincidence, but Kim Donor actually brought one of his books in the company of Crows and Ravens. So if you read that, I worked with that guy. And our lab became famous nationally for a particular study. And I'm just going to go into it right now. So my advisor, John Marsloff, whenever he first moved to Seattle and got his position at the University of Washington, he started a project on crows. I forget what the details were, but it involved capturing a number of them. And you do this in the research to attach little leg bands to the bird's leg, and that's just standard procedure. It helps you identify individuals after the fact. So he went across Seattle, caught a bunch of crows, banded them, but then every time they go back, they'd freak out and they'd scold him. And that kind of ruined the research he was doing. They weren't ignoring him the way that most birds would, they were actively attacking him. So he was curious, are they attacking humans because a human harassed them? Or are they attacking him because he wronged them? So he formulated an experiment to try to figure this out. The plan is he would wear a mask, a Halloween mask, a caveman mask specifically. And he would capture a bunch of crows and he'd see whether or not they freaked out whenever he went around with the mask, but not without the mask. Now, the problem with this approach, though, is that the caveman mask is kind of a grotesque imitation of a human face. So we needed to make sure they weren't just mobbing anyone who's wearing any Halloween mask. We needed a control mask, one that looked sort of like the caveman mask. So he used Dick Cheney. So he would wear this caveman mask, not Dick Cheney, mind you, and he would capture crows across campus using a net launcher. Now, a net launcher, for those of you who are not familiar, is very loud and very sudden. We use a rifle blank to propel a net out at high speeds. Take a look.
3, 2, 1.
So imagine you're a crow. You're there on the ground with your buddies. Whoa, I hit a button. Someone has left a pile of food on the ground, and you're down there eating, having a great time. I'm getting closer. There we go.
3, 2, 1.
You're having a great time when suddenly this happens. There's a very loud bang, a net flies out of nowhere and pins you on the ground. You're struggling, you're trapped, you can't get out. Your buddies who are lucky enough to escape are all flying around screaming, danger, 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 danger. When suddenly this guy runs out, pulls you from the net, holds you on your back, and attaches little bracelets to your legs, when suddenly, miraculously, you're able to escape. If you are a crow, we have given you every single reason to remember that face. Turns out they do. Every time we'd wear the caveman mask on campus, the crows would lose their minds. They would gather in large numbers. They'd start scolding and dive bombing. They didn't care about Cheney, and they didn't care about us when we didn't have the masks on. So, what exactly is going on in their heads when they're seeing this freaky individual? Well, recently we started delving into this. We've partnered with the Department of Radiology on the campus, and we started using PET imaging to try to figure out what exactly is happening inside their heads when they see or are exposed to different things. So, real quick, I should probably differentiate why we use PET and not something like an MRI. An MRI is great because it looks at what's happening in the brain in that exact moment. Problem though is that it's looking at what's happening in the brain at that exact moment. If you have a person, that's easy. You just tell them, okay, lie down, be very still. This machine is going to be very loud. It's going to be claustrophobic. Don't worry about that. Just look at this thing, or listen to this thing, or think about this thing. And a human will cooperate. A crow won't. We'd have to restrain it, and if we restrained it, then all of its thought processes are going to be, help, help, I'm being restrained, let me out. And it's going to ruin our results. So instead of using an MRI, we use something called PET. It stands for positron emission tomography. Here's how it works. First, we give the subject an injection of a radio tracer. This radio tracer is absorbed by the body metabolically. In fact, it imitates glucose. This means that if I was to give myself an injection of this radio tracer and then spend 10 minutes just running around, it would accumulate in whatever part of my body is consuming the most energy. So the lungs, the heart, and the leg muscles. But the crows weren't doing anything like that. We gave them the injection, we set them in the cage, and for the next 10 minutes, we exposed them to a stimulus. And they sat there quietly and looked at it or listened to it. And their brains were working. And whatever parts of their brain was working harder would absorb more of that radio tracer. And once it was fixed in their heads, we can anesthetize them so they're sleeping, and then we can scan their brains and see what they were thinking 10 minutes ago. And we can end up with something like this. So this is a composite image. The color parts are the radio tracer concentration. So you can see like the red is where it was most concentrated and the yellow is where it was not quite as concentrated. However, it's been overlaid on a CT image, like an X-ray. So you can actually see the beak, the brain, and even the eyes. It's something that catches people off guard is how big the crow's eyes are. You know, we only see a small part of them. So we set up an experiment. We were actually looking at what the crow was thinking, what was happening in their heads as they were exposed to those different types of faces and dangers. Well, first, we needed some crows. So this is a video taken from inside my car. We have a bait pile, a bunch of bread bits, and we also have a trash can. They love trash cans. They associate it with food. However, inside this trash can is a net launcher. And so, I forget how long this video is, it might be a bit long, but I have to wait until there's no birds flying, because I don't want the net launcher to fire while there's a bird in the projectile path, but eventually, well, you'll see what happens.
Great. Go.
Yeah, they're not happy. For this upcoming experiment, we did. We caught crows with the net launcher, and we wore a mask. Now, these are a bit more advanced than the caveman mask. We actually had a Hollywood crew come out and get latex molds of real people's faces. So, I mean, a human can still tell they're a mask, but they look more lifelike than the Halloween mask. We'd wear a mask when we caught them and pulled them out of the net and put them into captivity. They'd spend 2 to 4 weeks in captivity, and while they were there, they were being taken care of by the same person, but wearing a different mask, the carrying mask. They started to associate that person as the food provider, because they always cleaned their cage and gave them fresh food. Then we brought them into the imaging laboratory, gave them the radio tracer injection, and then while their brain was absorbing that radio tracer, we showed them either the carrying mask, which they knew, or the threatening mask, which they also knew. And it's not present on this graph, but we also showed them a third mask, a mask they'd never seen before, and the person wearing that mask was holding a dead crow. We scanned their brains, took them back to the aviary, and after a couple of days, we let them go. And PET reveals differences in brain activity depending on what they're seeing. So the known scary face, the person that caught them, that they knew was dangerous, that lit up parts of the brain associated with fear circuits, the amygdala. The known caring face, the person who took care of them, lit up the associated reward center. So they clearly associate that person with imminent food, which they like. The new person activated completely different parts of the brain than the known scary thing. So we have areas associated with memory and visual processing. They've never seen this person before, but they're forming strong memories, which they weren't doing for the other two faces. They're trying to figure out, okay, dead crow, this person's dangerous, I have to know this person, I have to remember them. Visual processing as well. They're fixing their eyes on them, trying to burn their faces into their brains. From my research, the last chapter of my dissertation focused on their ability to learn a task involving tool use and what's happening in their heads when they contemplate that task. So I used a variation of an old Aesop fable called the Thirsty Crow and the Pitcher. And I'm sure many of you have heard this. The story goes that there's a thirsty crow that finds a pitcher with a little bit of water inside. But it's too deep. No matter how much the crow reaches, it can't reach the water, can't quench its thirst. So what the crow does is it picks up stones off the ground, drops those stones one by one into the vase. The stones displace the water, pushing it up towards the surface until eventually the crow is able to reach it and quench its thirst. Well, I didn't use thirsty crows, I used hungry crows. And floating at the top of the water was a Cheeto. Cheetos were great for this experiment because they floated for a long period of time. The crows loved them, I loved them, and they turned the water orange. So any changes you make to the water level will be pretty easy to see. And I scanned each bird twice. The first time I scanned their brain with a PET scanner was also the first time they've ever seen this before. They have no idea what it is. The second time I scanned their brain was after they'd spent months learning how to solve this, being trained on how to solve the Aesop task. And so they suddenly knew for the second scan what exactly this was and what to do with it. And so by comparing their brain activity as naive birds versus knowledgeable birds, we saw some striking differences. The naive birds, the very first time they saw this apparatus, their brains lit up. the mesopallium, metapallium caudalia, you don't have to remember that, I'm not going to test you. Basically, the parts of the brain that are associated with higher order cognition. The parts of the brain that we associate with crows. They're using the smart part of their brain when they first see this because they have no idea what it is. Well, I say I trained them for 2 months, and that's true. Some of them were better than others, though. I grouped them into 3 different proficiency levels. We have knowledgeable birds, and then we have knowledgeable birds. So for the low and medium proficiency, these birds never actually solved the task. They interacted with it to varying degrees. So the knowledgeable birds, with quotation marks, well, we see some changes in their brain activity. The birds that never really learned the task at all, couldn't figure it out in the slightest, they just gave up, their brain kind of shut down. They weren't thinking about it anymore. All we saw was just areas associated with visual processing. They were staring at it, and that was about it. The medium proficiency birds, the birds that were still trying to interact with it, still wanted that food, they just couldn't quite figure it out, we still saw activity in the mesopallium. Again, they're still thinking about it. Higher order cognitive processing. But then some birds really stood out. Some birds figured this task out. So this is orange. One stone's not quite enough, need another one. There we go. So orange and 3 of her peers fully mastered this task. And when they saw it, when we compared their brain activity the second time around, we saw drastic changes. We saw areas associated with motor control and muscle memory and tactile responses from the beak, which in a way made sense. They know how to solve this task. They don't have to think about it anymore. In fact, this brain activity suggests that sort of like a ski racer mentally preparing to go down the course where all the turns and curves are, these birds are planning on going in there and solving that task. In fact, this shift from higher order cognitive processing to muscle memory, we see it in humans. 300 million years separate mammals from birds. Our brains are shaped very differently. They're arranged very differently. And yet, functionally, they work very similarly. And the nice thing about studies that involve PET imaging is that unlike a lot of studies that look at brain activity, I get to let the birds go when I'm done. All right, well, that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much for coming out. Any questions? Yeah.
The funerals, can you tell if the birds are actually grieving the loss of that bird, or are they learning something else that just relates to them being alive?
So the question is, do we know if the crows are grieving in the crow funerals? Well, there is anecdotal evidence to suggest they might be. If the bird's mate dies, then that bird will be more aggressive during the funeral, keep it going longer, and also be visually subdued for the next couple of days. That, to me, suggests grieving. However, we can't formally test that in the lab. I mean, there's a lot of ethical reasons behind that. I mean, how would you test that? We've actually thought about doing that, where we anesthetize the mate, so it's drugged, so it looks dead, but we couldn't quite figure out whether or not, because you can still see it breathing, and so that just raised too many ethical concerns, so we decided not to pursue that study. But we don't know if the birds are grieving, but we do know that they are learning about new sources of danger. That's probably why so many strangers show up to the funeral, even if they don't know the dead individual. Okay, question in the back, and then you would next.
How about like crows, like sometimes they'll leave gifts?
Yeah, so the question is, do crows leave gifts? And the answer seems to be yes. There was a news story about 5 or 6 years ago about a girl who was feeding the crows, and they would leave her gifts, and she collected them and categorized them, and it became like a whole news article. So yes, they do seem to leave gifts. We don't know whether or not it's deliberate. So there's 2 dominant hypotheses here. One is that crows completely understand the concept of gift giving, and they understand the ramifications behind it. They're trying to reward you for feeding them. They want you to continue doing that. And there is some evidence to suggest this. Male crows will feed their mate when she's on the nest, when she's incubating, so they clearly do understand the concept of giving something that I want to another individual for their benefit, but also for my benefit. The other hypothesis, though, is that it's incidental. And that's sort of the one that I subscribe to, simply because we can't prove that they know what they're doing. Basically, crows are curious, and they'll find things that interest them, particularly odd things like candies or keychains, just because they're weird, and so they'll pick them up like a toy. But food's way more important. So if they're carrying that around just to kind of tinker with it, and there's food, well, they'll put that down, pick up the food, and fly off with it, leaving the toy behind. And then, of course, the person comes out and goes, oh, they left me a gift. So again, we don't really know. But we do know that phenomenon is a thing that happens.
That thing with the mask where the crows would identify a particular object, do other crows that weren't exposed to the, to the trauma, do they also participate, or just the people?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. So the question is, with the mask, do the crows that react to the mask, were they only the crows that were specifically wronged or witnessed it, or were there other crows? And the answer is, knowledge of the caveman has spread throughout campus. So they clearly learn about danger socially. Now, we don't think that they're, going to the roost at night and being like, hey, let me tell you about this guy I saw. No, what happens is the mob itself is what teaches the naive birds what is dangerous. And we even see this, in effect, the other way. So one thing that I haven't talked about in this presentation, is osprey. Osprey are fish hawks. They're hawks that only eat fish. Crows that live in the same area as osprey know that they're harmless. In fact, sometimes the crows will mob the osprey to steal the fish away from the osprey. Point is, they're not threatened by it. But because osprey look so much like hawks, the crows that don't live near osprey, if you would expose them to it, they treat it the same way they would a red-tailed hawk. But if you put up a taxidermied osprey in an area where the crows are knowledgeable about them, young crows will show up and they'll see a hawk and they'll freak out and start scolding, and other adults will show up and go, where's the hawk? And they go, oh, it's an osprey, and they just leave. And that lack of response actually trains the young crows, okay, this thing I guess is not dangerous. So they're clearly looking at their peers to reinforce the thing that's going on. If this thing is dangerous, they're all treating it as dangerous, I'm going to treat it as dangerous. If this thing I think is dangerous, but they're ignoring it, okay, I guess it's not dangerous. So yeah, there is some learning going on.
So is there any evidence that you've just seen, even anecdotally, that this information that the crows are sharing with each other somehow is also getting responded to by other birds?
You mean like other species of birds?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's actually pretty common. So it's common for other species of birds to react to the alarm calls of individuals belonging to other species. So like chickadees will react to the alarm calls of juncos, for example. And in the case of crows will react to the alarm calls of ravens and Steller's jays, and probably also blue jays, but I haven't personally witnessed that.
But do some of those other species respond just to the mask? And
Oh, I see.
have they learned from the crows?
I don't know. I don't know if jays can remember faces. Anecdotally, I think maybe, but I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is because I used to have an office with a window, and so I'd throw peanuts out there for the jays and the crows, and I had 2 Stellar's jays that would show up and got to the point where they'd eat peanuts out of my hand. And of course, you know, my office mates thought that was really cool, and one woman wanted to try. Well, she is from Uganda, very dark skin. She put her hand out, they were far warier about approaching. But of course, she also has, you know, very dark skin, so that could be it. They could just be focusing on that. Any other questions?
Do crows migrate?
Some crows migrate. It depends. In Seattle, that's like a area of fairly temperate weather, so we'll have migrants come in from Canada. But it just depends on where in the country they are.
Right. So when you were doing the test on getting the Cheeto out, could you tell where those crows were from?
No, we couldn't. In fact, we caught them at the roost, so they could have come from anywhere in like a 10-mile radius. But I'm glad you asked that because, do you remember the crow I showed you in the video? The one that had the little orange leg band on her leg?
Yeah.
This crow. The reason why I have this photo is because about 3 or 4 weeks after we let those birds go, I got an email from a keeper at the Woodland Park Zoo saying, hey, yeah, I used to have a pair of crows that I fed that lived in the parking lot. They'd show up and I'd feed them. It became a regular thing. And one of them vanished, and I got worried. I thought maybe it got taken by a predator. Gone for 4 months, and suddenly she shows up again. And she's got all these little lead bands on her leg now. And I'm like, what? You gotta send me a photo. And turns out, this is Orange. And because I now knew exactly where to find her, I even set up some Aesop tubes in the parking lot to see if she would solve them. And, well, she doesn't, but unlike her mate and other family members and neighbors, she's also not afraid of them. So here she comes on the right, her mate's afraid to approach, but not her. She picks up all the Cheetos on the ground and marches off. And you'll notice I'm very careful to emphasize that Orange is female. And that's because there's a very strong bias towards adults and towards females for mastering the use of tools. In fact, all the adult females mastered it. Only a single adult male did, and the vast majority of the adult males were very bad at this. So crows, like dolphins, like chimpanzees, like bonobos, tend to have a very strong bias towards females when it comes to adopting tool use. Not quite sure why, but I have hypotheses.
So who builds the crow's nest? Is that the female?
The male and the female both cooperate to build a nest.
What's your hypothesis?
Well, I think, and I'm just kind of going off of basic information here, but because female crows tend to be smaller than males, they're under additional social pressures to use their brain. So for an example, let's say that someone throws out an entire loaf of bread, and there's food there, and all the crows come in to get it. Well, the biggest individuals, the most dominant individuals, all they have to do is just march up, and the others back away. So they tend to be male. They don't have to think very hard, they just show up and eat. The smaller birds tend to be female. Well, they gotta kind of use their brain. Okay, is there enough food there? Can I just wait for them to get full and leave? Okay, maybe there's not. Is there another bird that I can steal from? Is there other food in the area I can go? They have to constantly think. And so I think that's what's sort of primed them to be better able to learn to solve these things compared to males. The subadults, the birds that were about 2 or 3 years old, they were all, with only one exception, middle of the line. So again, I think that's because they don't have as much experience as the adult females do, but they're also low on the totem pole, so they have to think a bit more. My guess is it's a combination of the adult females I have are really successful. They have to be in order to have made it into adulthood. So whatever they're doing is working.
Is it true that the sub-adult crows will come back and help the nest very soon after
Partly true. It depends on what part of the country it is. In Washington, that's very uncommon, I think because the habitat's changing in their favor. So that means that a young crow does actually have a good chance of striking out on its own and establishing its own territory. In areas where the crow population is stable, there's generally speaking not enough space for most subadults to be able to establish a territory their first year, so they'll stick around their parents' territory. And we say they help raise their offspring. We don't really know if that's true. I don't think we actually have any evidence that they actively feed the babies in the nest, but they help protect the area from predators, like they join in on mobs, and they help their parents keep the territory safe from intruding neighbors who want to expand their own territory. So they help, but not in all ways. All right, well, I'm going to stay here, so y'all have any questions, feel free to come up. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lon. Appreciate that. That was very interesting. Anyway, hope there's plenty of refreshments back, and we also have some copies, signed copies of some Doug Tallamy books. If you don't know who Doug Tallamy is, Mary will explain it to you. Famous author we used in town we had him in town this summer to speak. Probably some of you went to see him, but we've got copies of his books back there. And I hope to see you all next month, third Tuesday in January is our next meeting. Thank you.
Next year.